So, including the reviews and all of the evidence we see, again, observational studies, rodent studies, in vitro studies, meta analyses, reviews largely point in the direction of no causation between artificial sweeteners and cancer. Hey, everybody. So, if you've been following along on my blog at Shortcut U on Substack, you'll see I've been reading and writing quite a bit about artificial sweeteners lately. And most recently, I dropped Alternative Eats Part 3, which is all about artificial sweeteners and cancer. And so I decided I'd make a video and break some of that down here. I think, as I alluded to in the intro on the blog post, a lot of the hype around artificial sweeteners and cancer is rooted in the name, artificial sweeteners, whereby a lot of people are concerned with something being artificial or unnatural, and they assume that because it's unnatural, it is bad for our health. This is rooted in the appeal to nature, logical fallacy, whereby, just like I described, we assume if things are natural, they're good for our health, and if they're unnatural, they're harmful or bad for our health. And this is a logical fallacy because it's untrue in a lot of scenarios. For example, cyanide and arsenic are both natural compounds, and they're both pretty bad for our health, right? They're poisons. And on the contrary, if we look at artificial sweeteners, and like I discussed in earlier portions of the Alternative Eats series about weight management, although artificial sweeteners are unnatural, the research largely suggests that they can be effective for weight loss or weight management if they help you get into a caloric deficit. So, anyway, I think that a lot of the fuss about artificial sweeteners and cancer, or really artificial sweeteners and health in general, has to do with this appeal to nature. And so I decided to look into the actual research and see whether the evidence supports this idea that artificial sweeteners are linked to cancer, or if it's kind of a lot of fuss for nothing. And like I said, if you want to follow along, you can go check this out. If you prefer to read the content, it's on my blog at Shortcut U. I'll leave a link in the description. Otherwise, I'll start breaking it down here. One really important thing I found when it comes to looking at this body of evidence is that the studies or the data we have in humans is largely consisting of observational studies, because we can't really do randomized controlled trials on uh, nutrition and cancer, because for one, it's just not really feasible from a practical standpoint, right? We'd have to take two groups of similar people, lock them up in a lab for an extended period of time, years to decades, have them follow the same exact diet, except having one group consume artificial sweeteners and the other group consume no artificial sweeteners. And uh, it's just really not feasible. And also, there's some type of ethical issue with giving people something that you suspect might be carcinogenic. And for this reason, there aren't really many randomized controlled trials on the topic of artificial sweeteners in cancer, or really other food groups in cancer. And the reason that's an issue is observational data is much less controlled, and therefore less reliable and probably less accurate, especially when it comes to nutritional epidemiology. Epidemiology being a flavor of observational research that looks at factors and trends of health or lack thereof in different populations. For example, due to the lack of control, we can't conclude causation in observational studies. We can only conclude correlation or association, right? We can't say X is causing Y because we're not controlling for a bunch of other variables that could be confounding the data. And yeah, so this pretty much just creates an issue when looking at observational studies. And that's something that we need to take into account when looking at this body of evidence, because all of the human studies essentially are observational studies. Now, we are fortunate that back in around 1965, a guy named Sir Austin Bradford Hill created a slight solution to this issue, which is the Bradford Hill criteria. These are essentially 9 viewpoints through which we can assess observational data and develop more confidence in our conclusions. So I'll pull them up on the screen here and I'll break each one down. The first being strength, which is how big of an effect is there. The second being consistency, which is if we look at several studies done by different researchers in different labs in different places with different populations, do we see the same outcomes, at least directionally, or do we see a variety of different outcomes? Specificity, which is pretty much about particularity. So, is the association very particular, like an association between a specific artificial sweetener and a specific cancer, or is it more broad, such as associating a diet that consists of a lot of artificial sweetener consumption that is associated with cancer, and thereby we're associating artificial sweetener consumption with cancer? Temporality, which is does the cause come before the effect? So, are subjects consuming artificial sweeteners and then developing cancer, or are they developing cancer and then starting to consume artificial sweeteners? Biological gradient, which is also commonly referred to as dose response relationship, whereby we ask the question, does more of the cause lead to more of the effect? So, does consuming more and more artificial sweeteners lead to greater and greater risks of cancer? Or does consuming a lot of artificial sweeteners, in other words, lead to greater risks of cancer than consuming small amounts of artificial sweeteners or no amounts of artificial sweeteners? Plausibility or biological plausibility, which essentially is asking the question, is there a biological explanation, an actual mechanism by which, in this case, artificial sweeteners are causing cancer? If we look at melanoma or skin cancer and sunlight, we see that there's a mechanism by which the UV rays from the sunlight damage DNA, and that leads to cancer. So the question is, do we have a mechanism like that linking artificial sweeteners and cancer? Coherence, which is pretty much looking at the entire body of evidence, that is observational studies, rodent studies, in vitro studies where we're looking at cells and isolated DNA. If we look at all of these together, uh, does the entire body of evidence agree with the findings in the observational data, or do they disagree? Experiment, which we kind of already covered, which would be randomized controlled trials in humans, which we don't really have for this body of evidence. And analogy, which essentially is asking, are there any similar compounds or similar exposures, similar causes that are shown to have an effect? So in this case, are there other compounds that are similar to artificial sweeteners that are already shown to be associated with or believed to be causing cancer? And it's important to note that none of these are sufficient or necessary, right? One alone does not mean that artificial sweeteners are definitely causing cancer. And the lack of one doesn't mean that there's definitely no causative relationship between artificial sweeteners and cancer, right? And, I'll read a quote from Sir Austin Bradford Hill, where he says, "None of my 9 viewpoints can bring indisputable evidence for or against the cause and effect hypothesis, and none can be required as sine qua non. What they can do with greater or less strength is to help us to make up our minds on the fundamental question: is there any other way of explaining the set of facts before us? Is there any other answer equally or more likely than cause and effect?" Right? Now that I've gotten through that kind of nerdy tangent, we can start looking at actual data. So, like I alluded to, when I dove into the research here, most of the studies in humans are prospective cohort studies, which essentially consist of gathering a group of subjects and collecting data on them. In this case, it's going to be through food frequency questionnaires, where you give them a questionnaire with questions on how often they've eaten a given food or consumed a given drink in the past year, the past month, the past week, etc. And other kind of flavors of this type of questionnaire are dietary food records, where they'll recall in the past 24 hours pretty much exactly what they ate or how much of different foods or drinks they consumed. And the best versions of these types of studies will repeat these questionnaires or food records throughout the duration of the study, which is often going to be several years or sometimes even several decades. But a lot of the studies I found only utilize baseline questionnaires or food records. So looking at that first questionnaire or food record, and then 10 years later, or however long the study is, coming back and looking to see if individuals who reported consuming more artificial sweeteners or less artificial sweeteners at baseline at the beginning of the study ended up getting cancer more or less often. Now, there are also case controlled studies that are available. These are another type of observational study where you have a group of individuals who already have the disease. So, in this case, it would be cancer, and you pair them to the best you can with similar subjects who don't have cancer. You administer a questionnaire about the foods and drinks they were consuming in the past, and then you try to see if there's some type of association. And this type of study is generally seen as even less reliable and less accurate than observational studies. Um, One significant issue being recall bias, whereby subjects who already have the disease, again, in this case, it would be cancer, are more likely to recall being exposed to whatever you're asking them about. But, anyways, we can dive into some of the prospective studies, most of which I found show no association, right? So I'll pull some of them up. Here we have a study by Chiselas and colleagues from 2019. In the results here, the consumption of sugary drinks was significantly associated with the risk of overall cancer uh, and breast cancer. The consumption of artificially sweetened beverages was not associated with the risk of cancer. And if we come up top, we see overall they had over 100,000 participants, aged 18 and over, mean age 42, follow-up time was 5 years, and so on and so forth. We look at another one here, this one by Hodge and colleagues from 2018, looking at obesity-related cancer specifically. And if we go to the results section, for sugar-sweetened soft drinks, the hazard ratio for obesity-related cancers increased as frequency of consumption increased. For artificially sweetened soft drinks, the hazard ratio for obesity-related cancers was not associated with consumption. Another one here, this one by Her and colleagues, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Results, we documented 109 EOCRC, which I believe is early onset colorectal cancer. Compared with individuals who consumed less than one serving per week of sugar sweetened beverages in adulthood, women who consumed greater or equal to 2 servings per day had a more than double risk of EOCRC. If we go down, each serving per day increment of sugar sweetened beverages intake at 13 to 18 years was associated with a 32% higher risk, but replacing each serving per day of a adulthood sugar sweetened beverage intake with that of artificially sweetened beverages, coffee, reduced fat milk, or total milk was associated with a 17% to 36% lower risk of this early onset colorectal cancer. So actually replacing sugar sweetened beverages with artificially sweetened beverages, in this case, they predict will lead to a decreased risk in cancer. And we look at another one here, this one by Heath and colleagues. In models including adjustments for body mass index and energy intake, there was no higher risk of incident RCC, which in this case is renal cell carcinoma, associated with consumption of juices, total soft drinks, sugar sweetened soft drinks, or artificially sweetened soft drinks, right? So no connection found there. And one more here by Zhao and colleagues from 2023, looking at liver cancer, chronic liver disease mortality. And they found during a median follow-up of 20.9 years, if we look down here, compared with intake of 3 or fewer artificially sweetened beverages per month, individuals who consume 1 or more artificially sweetened beverages per day did not have a significantly increased incidence of liver cancer. Right, so a lot of these studies, I only picked out a few, but if you go back to the blog post, you can see all the ones I cited. How many do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 found no association between artificially sweetened beverages or artificial sweeteners and risk of cancer incidence, so being diagnosed with cancer, or cancer mortality, dying from cancer. Now, some of these studies did show a positive association. We can check some of those out as well. We'll look here, this one by Debra et al., I believe from 2022. And this is actually a follow-up to one of the other studies we looked at by Chiselas and colleagues, looking at the Nutrinet Santé cohort, which is a group of subjects from France. Overall, 102,000 adults from the French population-based cohort. This time the median follow-up was 7.8 years. An interesting thing about these two studies is that they're some of the better quality studies I kind of alluded to before, where they repeated their dietary intake or the dietary food records every 6 months, I believe, across the period of the study. And if we look at the results, we'll see compared to non-consumers, higher consumers of total artificial sweeteners had higher risk of overall cancer. In particular, aspartame and acesulfame K, both types of artificial sweeteners, were associated with increased cancer risks. Higher risks were also observed for breast cancer and obesity-related cancer for total artificial sweetener consumption. And here we see by Schernhammer and colleagues from 2012, when the two cohorts were combined, that's the Nurses Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, over 22 years of follow-up. When the two cohorts were combined, there was no significant association between soda intake and risks of non-Hodgkin lymphoma and multiple myeloma. However, in men greater than or equal to one daily serving of diet soda increased risks of non-Hodgkin lymphoma and multiple myeloma. We observed no increased risks of non-Hodgkin lymphoma and multiple myeloma in women. So it's only in men, but still a statistically significant increase in risk. So what do we do here with this data? One important thing to note is the difference in absolute risk in these positive findings. So if you look in the blog post here, I broke down the findings from Deborah's and colleagues. That's the follow-up study from the Nutrinet Santé cohort in French adults. And I broke down the absolute risks before adjustment for covariates or confounding variables by percentage of incidence of cancer. So if we look at overall cancer incidence per total artificial sweetener consumption, for example, we have non-consumers having 3.1% incidence, low consumers having 3.92% incidence, and high consumers having 3.17% incidence. And you'll see the hazard ratios, which are the relative risks after adjusting for confounding variables. So pretty much taking into account differences in BMI, overall diet quality, smoking status, things like that, age, and then looking at whether or not artificial sweeteners still have an effect after adjusting for those variables. You see the hazard ratio is 1.14 for low consumers here and 1.13 for high consumers. And you'll see I did the same thing for the other positive findings in the study. But if we scroll down and look at it graphically, we see here there's really not a clinically significant difference, right? So my point being, the difference between non-consumers and high consumers is 0.07% in cancer incidence. So even if that was a legitimate statistically significant finding, which it is, although since it's so small and since we already addressed there's inaccuracy and unreliability in these food frequency questionnaires, it's highly likely, in my opinion, that the difference in accuracy between what subjects were actually consuming and what they reported consuming is probably greater than the difference in outcomes. Even if they were significant or accurate, I should say, we see when you graph them out, you can barely tell the difference between any of them, right? There's barely a difference in outcomes. So it's an extremely small effect. If we return to strength, the first viewpoint of the Bradford Hill criteria, there's an extremely weak association here. And this is true across the other positive findings that I cited in the blog post here. You can go and check those out as well. You'll see that across the board, none of them found really clinically meaningful findings. If we go down here, we can see it's kind of exaggerated even more if we look at the hazard ratios. For this, I took the largest hazard ratio found in that Deborah's et al. Study, which was breast cancer risk between the different categories of aspartame consumption. We see here the non-consumers are the reference, so we just have them as 1. Low consumers, there's a 1.09 hazard ratio, so a 9% increase in relative risk compared to non-consumers. In high consumers, it's 1.22, which is a 22% relative increase. But if we put it on this scale, and I have it at a scale of 200 for a reason, you can barely tell the difference between them. Now, if we scroll down, the reason I had it at a scale of 200 is if we go back to that paper by Austin Bradford Hill that I cited earlier. Back in the 1700s, he talks about how the risk of scrotal cancer for chimney sweeps. So these were largely young boys who were going into chimneys and sweeping them to clean them, uh, was 200x. So there was a 200x difference. The hazard ratio would be 200 compared to similar coworkers who weren't sweeping chimneys, right? So essentially, this is a classic case of the epidemiology and the history of epidemiology where looking at an extremely strong association allowed a guy named Percival Pott to conclude that uh, sweeping chimneys, or specifically the soot in the chimneys that was getting on these young boys' testicles or their scrotums, was causing scrotal cancer, right? So just take a look again. The difference here when we found a causative relationship, 200x to 1, versus what the differences look like here when we're trying to determine if there's a causative relationship between aspartame consumption and breast cancer, right? And if we move further on in the Bradford Hill criteria, we'll see that we've already sort of alluded to the lack of consistency in these findings, in that many studies that I found anyway show no association at all. So it's not like across the board, all of these prospective cohort studies are showing an increased risk. In fact, there are a few that are showing decreased risk, although those findings are just as trivial, just as weak as the ones in the positive studies, or the studies with positive findings. I don't think that, consuming artificial sweeteners is actually reducing risk of cancer. But my point is, across the board, we have some studies showing a decreased risk of cancer with higher consumption of artificial sweeteners, some showing an increased risk, and then a lot showing no association, right? So there's a general lack of consistency. And that also kind of alludes to a lack of specificity as well, in that you have some studies showing that there's an increased overall cancer risk, some studies showing a decreased overall cancer risk. You have some studies showing that there's an increase for specific cancers, and others showing a decrease for that same cancer. For example, in one of the studies, Deborah's and colleagues that I was just talking about, they showed a statistically significant increase in overall cancer risk for total artificial sweetener consumption, and an increase in breast cancer risk for aspartame consumption. And if we look at another study by McCullough and colleagues, we see that they looked at cancer mortality, which is different than cancer incidence, to be fair, but still they found no statistically significant difference when it came to overall cancer. And then when adjusting for BMI, they found no statistically significant difference for breast cancer as well. Although they did find a statistically significant increase in the risk of pancreatic mortality from pancreatic cancer, again, which was trivial. So my point is, we have some studies showing statistically significant increases in a specific cancer, and then other studies showing no statistically significant difference in the same exact cancer. So we're lacking strength, right? There's a extremely weak associations. Consistency of the associations is also lacking, and specificity of the associations is lacking. And if we keep going down the Bradford Hill criteria, we'll also see that the dose response relationship, at least in the studies that I found, is also lacking, right? So in particular, I used the example of a study by Bassett and colleagues from 2019. And if you go through, you'll see that I listed out the absolute risks in percentages and the hazard ratios. And I also graphed them. When you look at this graph, you'll see that there isn't, as we would expect if there was a causative relationship between artificially sweetened beverages, or soft drinks in this case, and non-obesity related cancers. We would expect to see that the higher the consumption, the higher risk of cancer. And to a degree, this is true, except it's not really clean, right? So we see there was a statistically significant positive trend if we look at across all of the data points together. But if we look at them individually, we see that there are only statistically significant outcomes for an increased risk for subjects consuming 1 drink per day and those consuming greater than 1 drink per day. And we see that actually, although it's not statistically significant, the differences for 1 to 3 drinks per month and 1 to 6 drinks per week, their hazard ratios were lower than the category of never consumers, or individuals consuming less than 1 drink per month. And we also see that the difference between individuals consuming 1 drink per day and individuals consuming greater than 1 drink per day does not exist, right? There's no increase in risk going from 1 drink per day to greater than 1 drink per day. And we see this across, again, essentially all of the positive findings that I cited in the blog post. where there's no dose response relationship. There isn't a gradual increase in risk in most cases as you consume more and more artificial sweeteners or more artificially sweetened drinks. There is not a dose response relationship or a biological gradient, as it's cited in the viewpoints for the Bradford Hill criteria for artificially sweetened soft drinks, artificial sweeteners, and cancer risk. And if we zoom out, right, and we start to look at coherence, another one of the viewpoints from the Bradford Hill criteria, we see that the rest of the body of evidence generally agrees that there's no association between artificial sweeteners and cancer, right? If we look at meta-analyses, one I think that's pretty notable is the one conducted or sponsored, I guess, by the World Health Organization that they used for their guidelines on non-sugar sweeteners, which is essentially the same thing as artificial sweeteners. You see it here. I'll pull up the PDF. Uh, what they found was for cancer mortality, 3 prospective cohort studies comprising 4 cohorts reporting on the risk of cancer mortality were included in meta-analyses as assessed in prospective cohort studies. No significant association was observed between higher intakes of non-sugar sweetener containing beverages and cancer mortality. Again, non-sugar sweeteners essentially being artificial sweeteners. You can see the forest plot. And if we scroll down, they find essentially the same thing for cancer incidence. So if we look, a total of 48 studies investigating the association between non-sugar sweeteners and cancer were included in meta-analyses, 39 case-controlled studies, and 9 cohort studies. As assessed in prospective cohort studies, no significant association was observed between higher intakes of primarily non-sugar sweetener containing beverages and any type of cancer. And again, you see the forest plot here. They found no association in those cohort studies. If we scroll down, we see, looking at the evidence kind of more categorically, they go through by cancer type. Most of these studies do not find statistically significant results, right? The only ones that do are the ones that are bold. And if we look at all of them, pretty much all of them are looking at case-controlled studies. A couple of them show increased risk. So for bladder cancer, the case-controlled studies showed a 1.31 odds ratio, or a 31% increase in relative risk. For cancer of the larynx, it was 2.34. So actually a pretty big difference, relatively at least. But if we look, some of the cancers also showed decreased incidence. If we look at the odds ratio for lung cancer, it shows a 60% decrease, right? An odds ratio of 0.4. If we look at ovarian cancer, there's an odds ratio of 0.56, which is a 44% decreased risk. If we scroll down, we do see the odds ratio for non-related obesity cancer from one cohort study being 1.23, and I believe that's the study we just looked at by Bassett and colleagues. But anyways, my point is, if we want to go and say, oh, well, it seems like artificial sweeteners are associated with increased risk of cancer, or it seems like they're causing cancer based on findings from these case-controlled studies in bladder cancer, we also need to say that, oh, consuming artificial sweeteners actually might decrease your risk of lung cancer or decrease your risk of ovarian cancer. But we don't say that because, like I mentioned earlier, these case-controlled studies are pretty unreliable, or even less unreliable, or more unreliable and more inaccurate than the prospective cohort studies. And that's just one of the meta-analyses. If we look at others, we'll see that they agree in that they find generally no association between artificial sweeteners and cancer. If we move on to in vitro and animal models, we'll see, as I wrote here in the blog post, when it comes to in vitro, i.e. experiments with cell cultures and animal studies, researchers have largely found that artificial sweeteners are not genotoxic or causing damage to genes or carcinogenic, even when using animals that are genetically engineered to be more susceptible to developing cancer and when using high doses of artificial sweeteners. So a lot of these studies testing whether artificial sweeteners are leading to cancer in animal models or in cell models are using animals that are genetically engineered to be more susceptible to cancer, so more likely to develop cancer. They do this to make the studies more sensitive. So even if there's a small effect, we're more likely to find it. And even when using really high doses of artificial sweeteners, they generally show no increase in cancer incidence. And there are a few notable exceptions to this that were conducted by a lab funded by the Ramazzini Foundation, which is a group in Italy that funds a lot of or conducts a lot of cancer research, largely in rodents, as I understand it. They did find increased risk in cancer in rats and mice. This is one study, the first one from 2005. The results of this mega experiment indicate that APM or aspartame is a multipotential carcinogenic agent, even at a daily dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram body weight, much less than the current acceptable daily intake. For reference, the acceptable daily intake is the amount of a given substance that organizations like the FDA believe you can consume indefinitely every single day without any side effects, or without any adverse effects, any negative outcomes. I believe for aspartame, it's 40 milligrams per kilogram as judged by the FDA. Anyways, getting back to the quote, on the basis of these results, a reevaluation of the present guidelines on the use and consumption of aspartame is urgent and it cannot be delayed. We look at the follow-up study, this one from 2007. Our results show a significant dose-related increase of malignant tumor-bearing animals in males, particularly in the group treated with 2,000 parts per million of aspartame, a significant increase in incidence of lymphoma/leukemias in males treated with 2,000 parts per million, and a significant dose-related increase in incidence of lymphomas, leukemias in females, particularly in the 2,000 parts per million group. And C, a significant dose-related increase in incidence of mammary cancer in females, particularly in the 2,000 parts per million group. And there's a third study conducted in 2010 that generally shows the same thing. Now, the issue is, first, that external groups have reviewed these three studies and heavily criticized the design and the findings. Most notably, if we look at the European Food Safety Authority, they, in 2006, right around the publishing of, I think, the first study out of this group, wrote a review where they looked at the study and essentially brought it into context of all the other data and determined whether or not they needed to reevaluate their conclusion that aspartame does not lead to cancer, just like the authors of that rodent study suggested they should do. And if we go into the PDF, we'll see here. Geez, just got to get this highlighter to work. In the view of the panel, the study does not provide evidence of a relationship between administration of aspartame and induction or enhancement of the development of lymphoma/leukemias in rats. This conclusion is based on the absence of a dose-response relationship for the tumor incidences, which is remarkable given the width of the dose range if the assumption is made that this is a treatment-related response. So although the authors of those studies cited a dose-response relationship, when external groups went back and reviewed, they determined that actually there wasn't really a dose-response relationship found in the actual data. And moving on to the second bullet, the fact that the incidence of lymphoma/leukemias in both female and male treated groups fell within the respective historical control range provided by ERF for each sex, ERF being that research group that has historically done a lot of studies in rats and mice. Moreover, the low incidence in the female control group had a significant influence on the outcome of the statistical analysis. So basically, when they went back and looked, that group provided the historical range of cancer incidences. So in other studies looking at similar rats and mice over a similar range of time, the average occurrence of cancer. When they did that, they found that although in some cases the incidence of cancer in the rats and mice consuming aspartame was higher, it was still within that historical range of what was normal for these rodents in terms of cancer incidence. And they also found that the fact that one of the control groups, particularly they cite a female control group, had a very low incidence of cancer, it made it seem as if the subjects, the rodents consuming aspartame, had a super high incidence, but it was really only a comparison to what happened to be a low incidence for that female control group based on, again, the historical records of the occurrence of cancer in these rodents. Moving on to the next bullet point, the aggregation of the hemolympho-reticular tumor types for statistical purposes involving a combination of tumors of different cellular origin, which is not justified in the view of the panel. In the report of the NTP pathology working group, it was noted that, quote, NTP does not routinely subdivide lymphomas into specific histological types as is done by the Ramazzini Foundation. However, the PWG accepted their more specific diagnosis if the lesion was considered to be consistent with a neoplasm of lymphocytic, histiocytic, monocytic, and or myeloid origin. So pretty much the point is that the authors in these rodent studies divided up the cancers in a way that is not standard for these types of studies. And so the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, kind of dinged them for that reason. And if we keep going down, we'll see more and more criticisms. One to note is they also cited that these studies were kind of unique or abnormal because they fed the rodents aspartame throughout the entirety of their lifespan. And what's standard is to feed the subjects aspartame through the majority of their lifespan, but not until the very end of life, because at the end of life, due to accumulation of age and inflammation, due to the rodents simply getting sick as they get older, there is kind of a false positive identification of cancer due to the ill health associated with older age. Um, let's see, they talk about it right here. The fact that, in particular, the lung was one of the major organs affected by the main subtypes, lymphoimmunoblastic lymphomas and histiocytic sarcomas of the hemolympho-reticular tumors. This tumor type, alternatively named lymphosarcoma in other diagnostic classification systems, such as IARC 1993, occurs at a high incidence in some strains of rats, not particularly Sprague dolly rats, which is the ones they used. However, this tumor normally occurs primarily in the spleen. In contrast, in the Ramazzini study, this tumor often occurred in the lungs. In addition, it is well established that this pulmonary type of lymphoreticular tumor may occur as a consequence of severe chronic respiratory disease, as occurred in the present study. And then they go on to pretty much talk about the specifics there. The point is that they found that it's not standard to give aspartame or any substance throughout the lifetime of a rodent because it can lead to faulty results and overestimation of the occurrence of cancer in some cases. And they also identify that when they had an external pathology group go and look at the same rodents that were preserved from these studies, they in some cases disagreed with the findings of the original authors, where the original authors diagnosed some of these some of the images of these rodent cells as cancerous, whereby this external pathology group found that in some cases they didn't diagnose these pathology images as cancer. So, in other words, they just disagreed with the findings when they looked at the raw pathology images. So, my point being, although there are these three exceptions in rodent models where there seems to be some increased incidence of cancer, specifically with aspartame consumption, first off, these studies were heavily criticized by external reviewers, namely the European Food Safety Authority. And also, when looking at the uh, entirety of rodent data from a broader lens, we see that they really are an exception, right? If we look at a meta-analysis, it has pay a paywall, so I can't show you the actual data. But if you look in the abstract, the search yielded 10 original APM, again, aspartame carcinogenic bioassays on rodents. The aggregate effect size suggests that aspartame consumption has no significant carcinogenic effect in rodents. So they found, when doing a meta-analysis and looking across several studies, 10, they found largely that there was no association. And if you go in and get access to the actual study, you'll see that of the 10, only 3 showed positive associations, and the only 3 were the ones from this one particular lab, right? And even in their meta-analysis, where they heavily weighed the results from those studies. So if you don't know, in a meta-analysis, they take results from a bunch of studies, combine them together, and see what the findings say overall. And they commonly will unevenly weigh the influence of different studies on the overall outcome, right? So in this case, for example, the Ramazzini studies had more rodents included in their models than the other studies. So they were weighted more heavily than the other studies. And it was pretty significant. It was like 60% to 80% weight. So 60 to 80% of the overall effect seen from the combination of all these data came from these 3 studies. And still, even then, their meta-analysis largely found no association between aspartame consumption and cancer in rodent models. And now that you've had your fill of me talking about rodent models, my general point is, again, if we zoom out and look at all of the evidence, the observational studies, which are prospective cohort studies and case-controlled studies, the meta-analyses, the in vitro studies, the animal models, and also the reviews. We can look at one here by Guzin and colleagues from 2023, December of 2023. We see they looked at artificial sweeteners and health outcomes in general, right? Not just cancer. And they found here in the abstract, moreover, recent studies have established an association between artificial sweeteners and cardiovascular risk and diabetes, which is a conversation for another day. Importantly, the majority of research data show no link between the use of artificial sweeteners and cancer risk, right? So this is a review looking at the data categorically, not necessarily looking at the numbers from a meta-analysis perspective, but just looking at what the studies show, and they found largely no link between artificial sweeteners and cancer risk. So, including the reviews and all of the evidence, we see, again, observational studies, rodent studies, in vitro studies, meta analyses, reviews largely point in the direction of no causation between artificial sweeteners and cancer. And that leaves us with three remaining viewpoints from the Bradford Hill criteria to look at this observational data from. Experiment, which we kind of already covered, saying that there really are no randomized controlled trials on this topic. Temporality, which out of all of these 9 criteria is actually to some degree sufficiently and reasonably met by these prospective cohort studies, because they do uh, administer questionnaires identifying subjects that are consuming artificial sweeteners first, and then identify individuals who uh, are diagnosed with cancer or die from cancer later on. So they do identify the cause coming before the effect in this case, or the potential supposed cause coming before the effect. I will say we can't still completely rule out reverse causation, whereby, for example, individuals might be leading a generally unhealthy lifestyle that leads them to develop obesity and type 2 diabetes, which put them at higher risk for cancer, or maybe just that diet that or lifestyle they were following that led to them being obese and having type 2 diabetes is what actually caused their later on cancer diagnoses. But it seems like the artificial sweetener consumption is causing the cancer diagnosis, because after they became overweight or developed type 2 diabetes, they started consuming artificial sweeteners, and so that is associated with cancer risk. But to be fair, these prospective cohort studies do generally satisfy the viewpoint of temporality. And lastly, we have analogy, which, as I talked about at the beginning, we could just identify a bunch of unnatural compounds and say, oh, well, this is unnatural and this causes cancer. Artificial sweeteners are unnatural, and so they likely cause cancer as well. But like I described, the appeal to nature is a logical fallacy and probably not something we should weigh super heavily. When it comes to actual more specific analogies, for aspartame specifically, analogy actually might suggest that there isn't an increased risk in cancer, because aspartame is broken down into methanol, aspartic acid, and phenylalanine, all three of which are naturally occurring in the body, and all three of which are found in higher concentrations in fruits, vegetables, meat, and meat, and dairy when we consume them than when we consume artificial sweeteners. So if we expected artificial sweeteners to be causing cancer, by analogy, we would also expect that consuming fruits, vegetables, meat, and dairy also causes cancer. But I mean, maybe some people might disagree. And again, a conversation for another day about meat and dairy. Most people would not say that consuming fruits and vegetables lead to cancer. So if anything, by analogy, this weakens the argument that artificial sweeteners, or aspartame in this case, is associated with cancer, or at the very least, it doesn't strengthen the argument, right? And that covers all of our Bradford Hill criteria and pretty much all of the data I have to go over from my deep dive on artificial sweeteners and cancer. If you're still tuning in here, I give you kudos, because I imagine the vast majority of people dropped out and were bored by my nerdy tangents and me talking about all this data, going through all these studies. So I give you kudos. I'll leave on the screen here kind of the summary of what I found in terms of the Bradford Hill criteria. All in all, my general conclusion after looking at all this data is that, generally speaking, largely speaking, there really isn't a great argument for artificial sweeteners causing cancer, or even being strongly associated with cancer. So personally, I'm not super worried about developing cancer because I'm consuming artificially sweetened beverages or throwing a little artificial sweeteners. into my yogurt or my coffee. Now, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this, so feel free to leave some comments down uh, here on the YouTube post or over at the blog post. And again, if you want to check it out, see the actual studies that I cited, go through the data with more of a fine tooth comb, feel free. You can go over, look up Shortcut U Substack on Google, or just use the link in the description. And also, if you want more health and fitness content like this, that's really research based, I post a lot of it over at that blog. I've done deep dives into lipidology, so pretty much the science behind cholesterol metabolism, on coffee, on research about preventing a hangover. I've done a lot about the research on growing muscle and talked a lot about studies on lifting weights and that type of stuff. And again, if you really like this one, you'll also like my deep dive on artificial sweeteners and weight management kind of earlier on in the alternative eats series. But anyway, that wraps it up for this post. I will catch you next time.